Alrighty. I will go ahead and get started as people are joining us. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for an Aero Insight. Today, our policy experts will be providing an update on the state of play for DOD cybersecurity compliance. I'm joined today with Ryan McDermott, Vice President for National Security Policy, and Jason Tim, our Director for Defense Policy and Integration. Jason also leads our AIA Cybersecurity Committee. And one quick item before we get going, if you have any questions, please submit in the chat. And at this point, I will turn it over to Ryan, who will go ahead and set the stage.
Oh, wait. Emily, I don't know if you want to kind of cover these slides of who we represent. We represent civil aviation, defense, international affairs, space systems. Next slide. And here are our advocacy objectives: aerospace and defense investment, policy regulatory framework, and 21st century workforce. Next slide, please. And just as a high level, here are AIA's priorities for strengthening American leadership in aerospace and defense. And you can see these: elevating American global leadership in aerospace, strengthening the resiliency of the defense industrial base, and enhancing strategic focus on supply chain and sustainability. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda. I will cover setting the stage, and after that, I will turn it over to my colleague. He will run us through this program. We'll get to Q&A, and Emily will return and help us sort of coordinate that piece and take questions from the audience, and we'll get our expert Jason opinion, and we'll wrap things up with some of the references and resources that we cover today. Next slide. All right. Again, I'm Ryan McDermott, the Vice President of National Security Policy Team here at AIA, and I oversee the AIA's councils, committees, and working groups, which are staffed with volunteer executives from our member companies. They do a lot of the work, the groundwork that allows our organization to advocate on behalf of our member companies in my area, defense policy and acquisition policy. Cybersecurity policy is obviously an important topic. We have a committee dedicated to it. And as you can see here, we start to set the stage. First thing I want to sort of cover here is why do we care? Why does DOD care? And, bottom line is cyber incidents have dramatically increased over the past 20 years with significant impacts to businesses and individuals alike. They can phishing attacks can shut down. There's ransomware can shut down a business. You'll notice that cybersecurity attacks sort of accelerated during COVID and sort of leveled off, but generally they've increased over time. And the projected cost going into the future are in the trillions of dollars. And so it's a big problem. Companies need to be doing this and individuals need to be working on this in any way. There's more e-commerce, digital currency, so it makes sense that cyber attacks we've got to do more to address this issue. Compounding this issue is that technology also evolves over time. So as we think about policy, which is largely backward looking, the challenge is making sure that it's adapting to the future context and allows us to protect ourselves going into the future. Next slide, please. Again, so to set the stage, we kind of want to bound what we're going to talk about today. There's two presidential executive orders, one that we'll quickly go over. One, it covers classified national security information, top secret, secret, and confidential. One, top secret, the definitional differences is grave damage equates to top secret to national security. Serious damage equates to secret, and then for confidential, it's damage. That's not what we're talking today about. We're not talking about classified national security information policies. We're talking about controlled unclassified information, which, as we'll get into, is a little bit more, it's harder to define. And you can take a quick look at this and we'll move to the next slide. All right. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Jason Tim, who is the expert at AIA on cybersecurity policy. Again, he leads our cybersecurity committee, And as a quick introduction, prior to joining AIA in 2015, Jason retired from the Air Force after 22 years of service, with many years of service in the Air Force acquisition enterprise. He's led AIA Cybersecurity Policy Committee for nearly a decade and will lead us through this Aero Insight. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and good morning, everyone. Appreciate you joining us today. Ryan, appreciate those kind words. So digging into CUI, coming off of Ryan's last slide, where we're focusing on not the classified aspect, not the National Industrial Security Program, but on the unclassified information. What is that information that is unclassified, but yet the government wants to have controlled? Because sometimes if you collect enough unclassified information, you could actually define something that technically is classified. So where can we find that information? Well, the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, has a CUI registry. In that registry, there are 20 groups. You see the groups down here in the blue rectangles. And across those groups, there's 126 categories of CUI. So lots of stuff out there. Specifically in the DOD categories, there's 5 specific categories of CUI listed there on the chart in front of you. And then go ahead, Jamie, to the next slide. And then, how is CUI defined? Well, this is the hardest part. According to the DFARS 252.204-7012 contract clause, it is either marked or otherwise identified in a contract by the government. I'm just going to paraphrase here, and it's why it's bolded and highlighted in yellow, or collected, developed, received, transmitted, and so forth by a contractor on behalf of the government in support of a contract. The hardest part here is that even with number 2, in my view, and in view of many of our members here at AIA, DOD must still at least identify to industry what are those unclassified crown jewel concepts that they want to have protected. Without that information, industry may end up protecting something that the government doesn't necessarily need to have protected, and not protect something that the government may want to have protected. So it's incumbent upon the DOD to at least have some kind of conversation with industry on every contract as to what those concepts are that the contractors should protect. Again, categories of CUI can be found at the National Archives and Records Administration, and then also the DOD CUI program. Links to these organizations, these websites will be provided at the end of the webinar. I believe Emily will be putting those in the chat later at the end of the webinar. Jimmy, go ahead. Yeah. And then, so what's so important about CUI? Well, first thing there, must be identified in a contract. If it's not identified in the contract, and industry does not have that information from the government as far as what is the most important stuff that they want to have controlled, then that kind of starts to fail the whole program, the whole process. Primes who receive the CUI will ultimately just need to decide how to flow that information down to the supply chain. And then every level, suppliers will need to, again, those that receive that CUI, determine, do they need to flow it to the next supplier? Do they need to flow the 7012 contract clause to the next supplier, which implements the NIST SP 800-171 and the whole compliance apparatus that transits from there? Ultimately, and this is kind of the blue bumper sticker down there, ultimately this cyber compliance effort relies on getting the CUI correct. Without getting it correct, we're kind of stuck in a loop of not getting the right stuff protected. Go ahead to the next slide, Jamie. We've got some timeline here. So this is kind of a historical timeline showing that when everything kind of kicked off from an interim rule standpoint in 2015 and up through and into 2019, we're focused mainly on the NIST 171. A lot of conversations there on how industry is going to comply with that. A lot of different rules coming through. AIA actually even published our own National Aerospace Standard 9933 to try to assist from a standpoint of a standard of controls that could accompany the NIST 171, not replace, but assist with. And then, the DOD started talking about CMMC in 2019 and developing out the model 1.0 for CMMC. And so right around in the 2019 frame, the conversation started turning towards CMMC, not turning away from 171, but focusing more on CMMC, with the understanding that the 171 is a major portion of the CMMC program. And then, we've been doing this. Oh, sorry, go back, Jamie. Yeah, thanks. We've been doing this for almost 9 years, 2015 to now. And of course, we're into 2024. You see that the last item here on the timeline is the December 2023 release of the CMMC 32 CFR proposed rule, basically making CMMC a real program. And the goal here, DOD's goal is basically to do away with with the self-attestation for CUI protection and compliance with the 171 or compliance with CMMC, if you will, and turn more towards third-party assessment certification, therefore giving more of a confidence feeling as to whether or not DOD's information is being protected across industry. All right, Jamie, next slide. Digging into the 32 CFR. So, I didn't have it on that chart previously. I do have it on another chart, but the DOD did go through, actually, I think DOD did go through a review, an internal review in 2021, and out of that came CMMC 2.0. And through that, they realized that they needed to have two separate formal rulemakings. One, the 32 CFR, basically making CMMC a real program, something that they could actually implement within a contract. And so we've got some movement on this. We did the comments to that proposed rule that was put out back in December were completed or due to the government back in February. Since then, the government has actually finished adjudicating all those comments, has drafted the final rule and submitted it to OIRA just a couple weeks ago. And we expect to see that rule in about the October or November timeframe. Next slide. Turning to the 48 CFR, this is the rule, this is the CMMC rule that really makes CMMC a reality within DOD contracts and within industry. Things are moving quickly. That rule actually, as of almost 2 months ago, been submitted to OIRA, and we're expecting to see that in around the August-September timeframe. This is the proposed rule again, so we'll have a bite at the apple on that to make comments to it. This one is actually, this 48 CFR is actually it will activate the 7021 clause within the DFARS. That clause, we first saw that in late 2021 with the former rulemaking of DFARS 2019 D041. The 7021 clause, however, was not activated at that time, knowing that we needed to move forward with the other rulemakings. All right, Jamie, next slide. Now we also need to turn to the 7012, the DFARS 7012 clause, which really kind of started the whole thing. This kind of kicked it all off. And so this is actually getting a facelift to better align with CMMC, most notably CMMC's direction to use the NIST 171 Rev 2. You'll see that here on the chart, as of 28 June, DOD is still working through that proposed rule for the modification of the 7012 contract clause. We see that an update should be coming out next month, about a month from now. And then down at the bottom of the slide, class deviation. So early May, just 2 months ago, DOD issued a class deviation stipulating that rather than contractors who have the 7012 contract clause in their contracts, rather than using the NIST 171 standard that was active at time of contract, that they need to be using the NIST 171 Rev 2. And that's specifically because the CMMC 32 CFR, the CMMC program, specifies the use of Rev 2 of the NIST 171. So the DOD issued that class deviation that basically will be in effect until it's rescinded, or probably until the 7012 contract clause is updated to include the language using Rev 2. So what does the future look like? Jamie, we'll go to the next slide. So another timeline slide. Borrowed this from a friend and then made some modifications here. We're looking at several items here across different works of effort, if you will. FARS UI rule, we've been waiting for that for about 9 years now, and there's some movement on that coming down the pipe. CMMC, NIST publications, and the recent CISIS or SIA incident reporting proposed rule that we just submitted comments to last week. Items to pay attention to here: the possibility of a January 2025 effectiveness date for the 32 CFR final rule, based on seeing that rule later this fall. And then the 48 CFR, which we're eyeing for about this time, I should say final rule, which we're eyeing for about this time next year. which will actually begin the implementation of the CMMC phases that you see there on the right-hand side of the red line. Coincidentally, the 48 CFR may line up closely with the FAR CUI rule, FAR CUI final rule. We'll see if that comes true. And then also to note, the 32 CFR final rule release actually signals the opening of what we call the CMMC marketplace from the Cyber AB, or as other folks are calling it, the CMMC market rollout. You see that's a blue arrow stemming off of the 32 CFR final rule being effective. Now, even at that point, when this 32 CFR final rule is effective and everybody's looking at it, CMMC will still not be able to be included in DOD contracts. That will not happen until the 48 CFR final rule is in effect, and based on the effectiveness date of that 48 CFR final rule sometime next year. But between let's say January and July of next year, CMMC market rollout means that industry may start getting in line and scheduling their assessments with C3PAOs, or the cybersecurity third-party assessment organizations that the Cyber AB has listed on their marketplace. They're on their website. May start getting in line for those assessments and starting through the certification process. And then at the bottom of the slide, you can kind of see this quick little CMMC phase descriptions. And Jamie, we'll go to the next slide. So quick regulatory highlights. Efforts in DOD are happening fast, partly due to this year, this being an election year, and partly because it took 2 years to get here since the last DFARS rulemaking in 2021, which installed those 3 CMMC clauses, technically CMMC clauses, if you will, the 7019 for SPRS, the 7020 that brings in DOD assessments, and then the 7021 clause, which is actually CMMC itself. However, what we're seeing from a standpoint of light at the end of the tunnel, is it truly light, or is that the train heading our way? Given the fact that there's a lot of companies across the defense industrial base that will be needing these assessments, especially for the level 2 third-party assessment, and then other larger companies probably for the level 3 assessments, using for the advanced persistent threat controls and so forth. So lots of work to be done. Lots of interesting time between now and what's happening with 48 CFR. We'll see how the market rollout goes, but it's exciting times. Jamie, we'll go to the next one. So what has AIA been doing since the beginning of all of this? So just like to call out that we've, number one, been urging our defense industrial base partners, those member companies and anybody else who hears, that CMMC is one thing, NIST 171 is part of it. And one does not replace the other, since 171 is basically CMMC, the standard that follows within CMMC. So it's important for the defense industry to work diligently through their 171 compliance requirements, working through their system security plan, working through their plan of action and milestone, but also understanding what's in the CMMC program. What does it say? What does it say about the plan of action and milestone, stipulations and allowances, and the different phases and all the different aspects of the NIST 171. And also what's not listed on the slide here is the NIST 171A, the assessment basically guide for 171, which lists out a whole lot of other items that can assist industry in meeting those controls in the base 171. Other efforts shown here include our National Aerospace Standard on Cybersecurity that I mentioned in the timeline slide, our voluminous comments on cyber publications over the years to the federal government, not just DOD, but other federal agencies as well, and meetings we've hosted with the DOD and our DIB partners. We're also planning additional Aero Insight events like today to further expand on what we've addressed today at a high level. Ryan, is there anything that you have before we go to questions?
Jason, that was a lot to absorb. Very great presentation. One of the things is, I'm relatively new to AIA, and so before we go to the turn it back to Emily for questions, I was just real quick, could you talk a little bit more, because one of the things I think is unique about AIA as a trade association is our CEOs at our companies are very well engaged, and your cybersecurity committee is also well engaged. Can you just talk a little bit about just a sort of case example of how you go through a process. You get a sort of one of these things that's coming out. We've got to come up with a position. Can you just quickly tell the group folks how you pull together comments to make sure that we get the right sort of feedback to our government partners?
Sure. Yeah, appreciate that. And I think I was probably talking quite fast. So there is a recording of this. You can always go back
Yeah.
and look and listen. With all those submittals across the years, and of course, not all of them were to an actual publication. Some of them were letters to individuals on certain subjects in the federal government. But when we see something come down through the Federal Register, and of course, before it comes out in the Federal Register and be published, we're paying attention to it from the far side, or from OIRA, watching things coming down through their unified agenda. We're watching as the DOD DAR Council is projecting what's going to happen with cases that they're working that actually will go through the OIRA for review and then ultimately out to publication. And so we're constantly watching what's coming down, the line. When it does hit, and be published, I'll look at it, and a lot of my committee members will reach out to me and say, hey, I think we want to comment on this. I'll put together an email and basically a schedule of, hey, okay, here's our schedule for comments over the next 60 days, and we drive toward those comments. A lot of times, sometimes it could be a short letter, 1 or 2 pages.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a 3 or 4 page letter with a couple attachments or a couple enclosures, one being a comment matrix and the other being many pages of general comments where we dive deep into specific issues. So it can be a
That's
big
Jason,
effort.
that's a great overview, and really appreciate that. We've got some questions coming in, and I want to turn it over to Emily to sort of take us through that. Emily?
For sure. Thank you so much, Ryan. And yeah, Jason, I'm just sitting here even absorbing some more of this information as I've worked alongside you, learning more about cybersecurity maturation model certification and the mouthful that is, and just what it means for our members that are in the DIB, and for AIA as an organization as well. You mentioned that this has been a several years long process. And over the past several years, some industry experts have raised concerns over CMMC, and in some cases, called for an end, and have made cases for other sort of programs. Ryan, Jason, is that possible? And what would need to happen for that to even occur at this moment in time?
Emily, I'll take the first part of that, and then I'll turn it to Jason to talk process. I've read a lot of these articles and know some of the players who've criticized CMMC, and essentially what it in cybersecurity policy implementation, and what it comes down to is sort of a critique of the cost versus the benefit, since there's an aspect where compliance is backward looking, retrospective, based upon threats. And because the environment is dynamic and evolving, that hackers are looking for always have other methods, and so compliance doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe. And so also CMMC in particular protects CUI, which is not necessarily a danger to national security. On the other hand, there's a case to say that if you've got a lot of data, that if it's CUI, it could be potentially of value to adversaries as it's aggregated. It's a challenge. It's a major challenge for businesses, government agencies, and individuals. And there's generally a broad consensus that we need to do something. And so there is a need, I think, to have a benchmark as a standard. Jason, the process probably better than anyone. Any additional thoughts on what I just said, and then also I think taking us through a little bit of the process question.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think just as with any DoD acquisition program, it takes years basically to iron out the wrinkles. I kind of put that in air quotes, iron out the wrinkles. That's what in the acquisition community, that's what developmental and operational test is all about. CMMC, I don't believe, is really any different, but DIB members can get ahead of the game by focusing on their NIST 171 compliance. From a process standpoint, I go back to that statement on the compliance. And that's really because compliance with the 171 is the vast majority of CMMC getting that certification. The only thing that really CMMC, the big step with CMMC is getting that third party assessment and then applying for that certification. But your 171 compliance is really the biggest thing here. And of course, that drives back to defining the CUI and getting that correct across contracts. I think from a process standpoint, I'd have to say that anything is in the art of the possible. DOD updates DFARS rules all the time, as we see, and not even just DOD, but FAR, updates rules all the time, writes new rules based on what's being directed through an NDAA. And then DOD is using those FAR rules for the most part and writing a DFARS rule on it. So just because a final rule has been published, I don't think means that the item is untouchable. I think that there's probably always going to be an option where even a new administration or people in the federal government may look at something and say, hey, I think we need to look back at this and see if there's a way we can streamline or make this better.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to go back to kind of the timeline slide if we can. Jason, can you tell us, you had a wonderful timeline slide. I don't know if we can go back to that one right there. One forward, I think. Yeah. There's a lot of moving lines of effort here. Can you tell us if any of these lines of activity are coordinated, and are there interdependence between these lines? Are they running on their own tracks, or what does this mean? How do these entities even interact?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I kind of mentioned on the CUI rule, the FAR CUI rule there. We've been waiting on that for 9 years. And in an ideal world, the FAR CUI rule would have been written first, and then followed by a DFARS rule implementing the CUI program and in DoD, and then ultimately, the initial, the first interim rule back in 2015 on the NIST 171 that the DoD implemented across industry. So you would hope that they'd be interactive, but sometimes we're having to play catch up. On the CMMC piece, there is some close knitness, if you will, with it and the NIST standards there, the 171 and the 172. And really, I mentioned the class deviation to the 7012 clause, detailing out the NIST 171 Rev 2. And that's really because NIST keeps going. The threat doesn't change, and so in order to look at items and make new items for action and controls within a standard, NIST keeps writing new versions of that standard and issuing for public comment, which AIA does comment on. So, the Rev 3 is actually coming on the street. We're expecting the Rev 3 is on the street as of earlier this spring, and we're expecting the NIST 172 Rev 3 to be released later this year. So, if the DoD hadn't issued the class deviation for the 7012 clause, then everybody would have had to transition to the Rev 3 pretty much immediately for new contracts based on how the 7012 was written. So DoD is now becoming a little more methodical as stipulating a specific release of the NIST 171. And then from the standpoint of the CISA or SIA, we're seeing several different rules across the landscape for incident reporting. SEC put out one I think it was last year, that we commented on. Of course, we've in the 7012 contract clause, there's language in there regarding reporting to Defense Cybercrime Center, DC3, and so we're commenting back to the federal government or to those agencies whenever they're looking for different incident reporting requirements that industry will have to comply with. So it's hard to say that there is lots of conversations across these lines of effort. Maybe there are. And I'm just not 100% privy to them, but I think there are, to a certain degree, conversations across those lines.
For sure. That it's helpful to know that there's at least some sort of, at least a conversation happening between all of these different lines of efforts as they move forward. Just for clarity's sake, I feel like there's a lot of, information that can get crossed if there's not conversation at least happening. So we do have a couple more questions in the chat. We have a couple from members of the media that are attending today. One is, like, does AIA see opportunities for reciprocity with CMMC, and have we had conversations about that?
So yeah, that's a hard one. Of course, the DoD is shying away from using the word reciprocity these days. They're using the word equivalency, but happy to glad it's really the same thing. Reciprocity really kind of sounds cooler though. Status of those conversations, those are ongoing. That's been an issue, especially on the international side, for 9 years. As soon as the DoD put out the initial first interim rule in 2015, that was one of our comments back was, hey, this is driving an international issue where other countries have their own way of doing cybersecurity, and so DoD is being very diligent in working either bilateral agreements with those countries or other kinds of agreements, especially now that CMMC is coming into play with the advent of a third party coming in and assessing those foreign companies who are suppliers to DoD primes, and sometimes are DoD primes in and of themselves. So they're ongoing, they're complicated, and I'm looking to get some more information from the DoD on how that process is going, and I'm hoping that by the time the 48 CFR final rule is implemented, that they will have an actual process in place, agreements in place across the board for that reciprocity between all of our partner countries.
For sure. Thank you. One more question from a member of the media, and then I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ryan to ask a couple more questions that we've gotten in. So why is the DFAR 7012 rule going to be aligned with the NIST 800-171 Rev 2? Would we expect to see a change to Rev 3 in the 32 CFR rule or the 48 CFR rule? Do we have that information?
So the 7012 contract clause currently states, let's kind of back up before May 2nd, when Defense Pricing and Contracting there in the DoD in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for ANS issued that class deviation. 7012 contract clause says basically to you, and I'm going to paraphrase, use the 171 that's in effect at time of contract award. Well, we've had the base 171, we've had the Rev 1, we've had the Rev 2, and basically when Rev 3 came out, Rev 2, according to NIST, it was kind of put into retirement, it's put out to pasture. But DoD looks at it and says, we're not quite ready to go to Rev 3 yet, so we're going to have everybody focus on Rev 2. It's been out there for well over a year. There isn't too much change per se between Rev 1 and Rev 2. There's some language here and there, but for the most part, it kind of flows along with where the Rev 1 was going as well. From a standpoint of converting to a Rev 3, when the 48 CFR rule comes out final next year and CMMC is implemented in DoD contracts, you never know. There could be an update to the 7012 contract clause and ultimately to the 32 CFR that basically states, hey, we're going to move to the Rev 3. But then that triggers a whole nother rulemaking apparatus there as well. So
sure,
good question.
Sure. Thank you so much. And I think, Ryan, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. We have a couple more questions in the chat that I'll let you go ahead and handle.
Okay. Thanks, Emily. Jason, here's one I think should be relatively easy to answer. It's more of a sort of definitional question is, can any company right now say they are officially CMMC approved at this time?
Good question. Technically, no. What you can say is you are 100% CMMC, or you are, sorry, get that word out of my mouth right now. You are 100% compliant with the DFAR 7012 contract clause, meaning you've implemented all 110 controls of the NIST 171 Rev 2. You've uploaded a score into the Defense Contract Management Association Supplier Risk Reporting System, SPRS. I remember that correctly, and that you've uploaded a correct score of 110. Sometimes there's companies that will upload a score of 110. The DOD's or the DOD's Defense Industrial Base Cyber Assessment Center there at DCMA, the DIBCAC, will schedule an assessment, come in, do an assessment of an organization and determine, well, you're not really 110, you're 108. You got a little bit of work to do. That, you know, that just means that you're on the road to success. So there is no mechanism right now at this time for a company to actually get an assessment and get a certification from the Cyber AB for CMMC. Now, that doesn't mean that a company can't schedule an assessment with a C3PAO. There are those third-party assessment organizations out there listed on the Cyber AB's marketplace website that could probably provide an assessment, but there's no apparatus yet in place to actually work that certification and be listed as, you know, CMMC compliant or you know, level 2 or something like that. One thing I did not mention earlier in the program, though, is that when CMMC is implemented with the 48 CFR final rule, every DoD company will need to be at least, every DIB partner who has contracts through you know, the support a federal government contract will need to be at least a level 1 compliant, CMMC compliant partner, and the controls that satisfy level 1 are listed at the CMMC website that will be provided later in the chat, and then and that's really 17 controls across the NIST 171. So it's not, and then that's a self-attestation that, hey, we are compliant with level 1 of the NIST 171. That'll ultimately transition to a level 1 certification through CMMC. Good question.
Thank you. Another question. Recently, in May of 2024, DCMA security team audited our company for NIST 800-171 Rev 2 to validate our SRS score accuracy. Is that basically equivalent to CMMC independent assessment?
Kind of, sort of, let's say. You know, so the DIBCAC, that's who came in to do that. If it was a DCMA security team, that'd be like I mentioned, the Defense Industrial Base Cyber Assessment Center there at DCMA. They go in. They've been doing this since 2019, actually, visiting companies who volunteered to do an assessment. This one actually may have been a joint surveillance audit. Those are specific audits that companies can have DCMA and a member of the Cyber AB come in and do an audit of a company's SPRS score, the score that the company assessed for themselves against the NIST 171 and 171A. And then they upload that score up to the SPRS system. So DIBCAP goes in and reviews everything. And like I mentioned before, they may say, well, we don't think you're actually the 110 score. We're going to give you a score of this, and here's why, and here's what you need to do to fix these issues. It is an independent assessment of sorts. It is somewhat related to CMMC because it's driving towards that CMMC compliance and possible in the future certification. One thing with the joint surveillance audits that was kind of a carrot held out to member companies that volunteer for that joint surveillance audit was that if they passed the surveillance audit with a perfect score of 110, that those companies would receive upon CMMC becoming live and in government contracts, that they would be awarded a certification for the level that they were working towards, again, with that perfect score. And then that certification would last for 3 years. What we saw in the 32 CFR rulemaking is that changed a bit. Instead of it being effective at time of 32 CFR, 48 CFR, really, I guess, activation or implementation, that 3 years is potentially backdated to the date of the actual assessment, rather than when CMMC became live. So we did make comment to that back to the federal government in 32 CFR, but close. But having the joint surveillance audit right now and having a perfect score does not give you automatically at this point in time a CMMC certification level, but it does lead to it.
Thanks, Jason. And again, there are questions continuing to come in. We're probably going to have to limit maybe 1 or 2 more here. And so the next one is a little bit of a trick question, because I don't know if we can really answer this for the company. And I think this is where we as an association can help sort of provide comments and make sure the feedback's there. But here goes. As a certified small business, who does some defense business and would be subject to the full CMMC level 2 audit, what options are there if we cannot afford to spend the amount required on upgrades, manpower, and audit costs to pass and maintain CMMC level 2? And so this gets at the concern about costs. And so I don't necessarily want to. So what are the implications if they can't get there and they're doing that type of work?
So that's a great question. Ultimately, implication is the ability to receive a supplier contract, or I'm assuming as a small business, you're going to be a supplier to a prime just to a certain degree, or in that supply chain. Not being able to obtain or maintain a CMMC level 2 certification using the third-party audit process and certification will ultimately, according to DOD language, limit your ability to play in the marketplace from a standpoint of being able to receive CUI. Now, what I mentioned earlier about getting CUI correct across the supply chain includes the flow down of CUI from prime to sub, and then sub to various suppliers in the entire supply chain. Getting that CUI definition pushed down throughout the supply chain, that's really the relief valve, if you will. So if for this small business, if there's an argument through a conversation with their prime that, hey, we really don't think we need that CUI, and here's why, and they come to an agreement, and they don't actually then receive that CUI in a contract, then through CMMC, only the level 1 will apply. And currently, without CMMC in a contract, if they don't receive that CUI in their contract, then they should not be receiving that 7012 contract clause being flowed down to them as well. So that's kind of the relief valve there. It all depends on how the CUI is defined and whether or not it needs to be flowed down to various levels in the supply chain. And before we turn off, I do see one other question here in here that I wanted to answer. Something here says, can we expect variation in one assessor to another when performing a cyber position assessment for 171? That's a hard question to answer, because we are all human. Without working from a specific script of here are your lanes, for each control, and only these items to solve that control are what's possible. An auditor can always say, well, I like to do this, or I like to do that, which may differ from other people. I think that's one thing that the Cyber AB is working very diligently in with their training of these third-party assessors to stay away from, and basically define, here's what needs to be assessed, here's how it's assessed, and here's how this rolls down the pipe. But there's always the possibility that the human element will come into play. So we just need to watch out for that.
Jason, thank you so much. I think based on the questions, the amount of content, and the interest from those who sent in questions, we'll probably have to do another Aero Insight at some point. So great. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And Jason, thank you so much for leading this discussion. Anything else, Jason, before we turn it to Emily? Because I think we're at our time to wrap up.
Yep, I think I'm good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Emily, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you, Jason, again for leading us through a complex but necessary conversation about cybersecurity compliance. We have some references and resources on the next slide here that we've used from today's Aero Insights. If you would like to view any of these resources, please just go ahead and send us an email. You can send me an email. It's right there, emily.hayes@aia-aerospace.org, or go ahead and send any member policy questions to teamnsp@aia-aerospace.org. If you have any additional questions regarding this topic, excluding the references or resources outside of this, please feel free to contact AIA's Media Relations, that's myself, or AIA members can contact the NSP team directly. Lastly, we have some more Aero Insights coming, as Ryan alluded to. We have several coming. If you go to the next slide, you should be able to see we have one on AUKUS, an industry at the center of AUKUS. We all have been hearing so much about what that means, so you can join our international team to learn more about that. And if you want to learn more about AI and navigating the regulatory landscape following Senator Schumer's convening of several different industry stakeholders earlier this year, you can join us on Thursday for a conversation about AI from our Vice President, Tim White. If you have, on behalf of the entire team here today, thank you so much for joining us. We truly hope you enjoyed this conversation, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.